Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Taylor. Before we get to that, we have got some new patrons to thank. So thank you to Evan, Kyle, and Blythe for joining us over on Patreon. We hope you enjoy all the bonus episodes over there. There's quite a bit of a back catalog built up. And then as a Patreon episode update, part 2 of the Francisco de Cuellar narrative, it's been recorded and it's in the process of being edited and finalized and made ready to go. And then we can finally put to bed the epic saga of the Spanish Armada for now. It's been a while, but finally it'll be coming to a conclusion with that. I guess with that, let's bring in Taylor. So Taylor, how's it going?
Pretty good. It is nice to be doing it again. I know we had a little break last week, but it's good to be back in the podcasting dungeon.
Yeah, we took a little break. That was kind of nice to have a weekend totally off work, quote unquote, so I could work on real work.
Right.
What have you been up to? We've had extra time to consume media, consume content.
It's been busy. Last week was the twins' birthday, so that's what I did last week instead of podcasting, was work on some of that. Other than that, media-wise, What We Do in the Shadows is back, and it's like the only show that I watch, I think, like as it's being released, because I just don't watch that many shows, but I absolutely love it. It's lived up to the hype in my head. I was a little worried that I was going to be let down, but it was excellent, so definitely watch it.
It's like rings on a tree for this podcast of like how many seasons of What We Do in the Shadows we've had to discuss, because like yet again we're back to it. Yeah, you've been watching baseball, been watching the Reds last few games.
I've been busy the last couple games. I haven't really been able to, but the offense seems to have gone cold for Cincinnati. Which
they ran into a buzzsaw brick wall Brewers rotation.
It's not good because I don't think the Reds pitching can hold up without a lot of run support.
And for those unaware, that's 3 straight shutouts for the Brewers. Those first 2, though, they were both 1-0, which is kind of crazy and nerve-wracking.
It is crazy.
I wish the Brewers could score some more runs on these occasions. But yeah, it's been fun to watch from the Brewers side of things. I just wish that they could do this when they play like the Cubs or someone.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the Reds are far too exciting and likable to want to see them get shut out.
These games on,
yeah. Do this to the Cubs or the Cardinals.
I think that's the problem with the Reds being such a young team, is you're going to have like skids like this.
Ellie De La Cruz had to like come back down to earth at some point.
Yeah, that was crazy. Can't steal every base.
So I'm glad that this is the series that they're taking a little break and they can turn it back on after.
Right.
Yeah, we show wise we finished Barry on HBO. We really enjoyed it, and then we had the whole previous season to watch also. So we watched a lot of Barry in a short amount of time. Very good show. It's fun to see Bill Hader in like a more of a drama role because he's such a good actor. It's fun to watch him show that.
I haven't seen that. That's something I'll have to check out.
It's really good. It's very funny, but there's also a lot of drama in it. I would say it's slightly skewed towards the comedy side of things, but it's very dark also.
Nice.
A lot of great acting. Stephen Root is probably my favorite actor in it. I don't know what he'd be most famous for people for, but he's Milton from Office Space, and he's Bill Dauterive in King of the Hill.
I was going to say that's actually, still watching through King of the Hill, and I feel like that's what I would have thought of first.
He's also the bank manager in Seinfeld when Kramer's trying to get his money for them not saying hello to him. I also, on the book frontier, I finished Jeffrey Parker's biography of Charles V. That was a big labor to get through. It was very good. It was very fascinating. Really helps me to set all of the reading, that I've done about like Philip II and slightly later times, helps to really put that in context. Definitely worth it if you're into that era in history.
Nice.
I guess we could get into our episode. Episode 111. So this week we have another very recent story. This one happened in 2020, and it takes us back to a place we've been before on the show, which is Galveston, Texas.
The place where nothing bad maritime or ocean related ever happens.
So Galveston has made some appearances on 2 previous episodes. Our episode on the whalebacks, the SS City of Everett, just happened to stop by Galveston just in time for the deadliest natural disaster in American history, the hurricane of 1900. We also talked about the Bolivar Roads Anchorage area. That was the site of the incident involving the OMI Charger in episode 60. That was that oil tanker where they were doing some welding in one of the tanks, and it apparently had not been properly defumigated.
That was a long time ago.
It was.
We talked about that.
Mm-hmm. It's a good episode. The audio quality on that episode's not great because I was accidentally using my webcam mic, but it's worth listening to for sure. So this week is actually the story of 2 vessels, as our stories so often are, though the primary focus is on a boat called Pappy's Pride.
Sounds like a bourbon. Is that a bourbon?
There's Pappy
Van Winkle.
Pappy Van Winkle, although my knowledge of alcohols is disappearing quickly because I was 18 months with no alcohol yesterday.
Excellent.
So that's good.
Nice.
That's a good way to be.
It does not appear that there is, but it sounds like it could be.
Well, not now. I feel like the name is kind of associated with this.
True.
Kind of be in bad taste. Pappy's Pride was a steel-hulled commercial fishing boat built in 1996. Just over 80 feet or 25 meters in length, with a beam measurement of 24 feet or 7.3 meters. She operated with a crew of 4 on board, consisting of a captain and 3 deckhands. She was registered in Houston, Texas. So as just a geographic note, Galveston is kind of at the entrance to the bay where Houston is. So they're both very active ports in their own right. But a lot of the traffic going through this area is headed towards Houston. The captain of Pappy's Pride was 56 years old, and he had been a shrimp boat fisherman his whole adult life. Working as captain of Pappy's Pride for 7 years and making 6 to 8 voyages per year on the boat. The other vessel involved today is the chemical tanker Bow Fortune, registered in Bergen, Norway.
I do like that we're returning to our roots here with the Norwegian vessel.
It's been a while. Bow Fortune measured 600 feet, or 183 meters in length, and 105 feet in beam, or 32 meters. She was built in 1999. She still operates for Bergen's Odfjell Shipping Company. Bow Fortune operated with a crew of 29 at the time of today's incident, and I believe that number is including the pilot, who boards the ship to bring her through Bolivar Roads. That's given as persons on board in the NTSB report. The captain of Bow Fortune was 57. He had 24 years of experience, 23 of which were with Odfjell, and 8 of which were as the master of Bow Fortune. He knew the Houston-Galveston area very well. He had more than 20 visits to the area during his career.
So this guy's not new.
Yeah, really neither captain is new to what they're doing here. So Bow Fortune, she's going to be in the Galveston area after being loaded in Lake Charles, Louisiana, with 15,748 tons of ethylene glycol, bound for Galveston so she could replace a faulty oil pump in an auxiliary engine and load some additional cargo. Is this our first episode with a tanker carrying something that isn't petroleum?
Probably. Well, what was the one off the coast of Spain? Was that a tanker?
That wasn't a tanker, but she was carrying like chemicals and stuff.
Oh, that's right. Was that the one where they had like random tanks and stuff just on?
Yeah, like barrels and boxes and
like not the way you're supposed to do that.
Sodium stuff just like on the deck where it's exposed to water.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that one wasn't technically a tanker. Yeah, we've mostly talked about oil tankers, so we get something different here today. Not that it really plays a huge part in the story. Ethylene glycol has a lot of uses, many of them involving use as a cooling agent, notably as an ingredient in antifreeze. That's the antifreeze part.
Is that the part that makes it taste good?
Yeah, I guess. So it's also used as a dehydrating agent during the production of natural gas, where it's used to remove water vapor during processing. So as we'll see, the actual content of the tanker doesn't really come into play here. Just interesting to see what that stuff was for. Ethylene glycol is at a health hazard level 2 on the NFPA fire diamond, so that puts it with things like carbon dioxide, chloroform, and ammonium phosphate.
So like not great, but not the worst.
Yeah, like it's not good for you. Like if you're constantly inhaling it or exposed to it, it's going to cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty low on the flammability scale also, requiring, quote, considerable preheating under all ambient temperature conditions before ignition and combustion can occur. So, like, that's not going to be a factor in today's story. Seeing the size disparity between the two vessels we just described, 80 feet and about 600 feet, we're not going to get to the cargo of Bow Fortune.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter.
In today's incident, which we'll get into now. So on January 14th, 2020, the fishing boat Pappy's Pride left Pier 75 in Galveston at 1:25 p.m. for a 3-day shrimping trip to Key West, Florida.
Sounds nice.
Yeah, I imagine the Florida Keys in January are probably pretty nice. By a few minutes after 3 p.m., Pappy's Pride had crossed over the Texas City and Houston ship channels, increasing to a speed of about 8.5 knots in the process. By 3:07, she passed the ferry landing at Port Bolivar, increasing speed to 8.8 knots and entering the Bolivar Road's anchorage areas.
I'm trying to follow along on the map here.
Actually, in the NTSB report, there's a very good
Is there a good map there?
chart showing waypoints here. Throughout all this, Pappy's Pride was being navigated by the captain, while all 3 deckhands were on the aft deck. About 10 minutes later, according to deckhand number 3, visibility dropped quickly due to fog as Pappy's Pride approached buoy 12. So we'll mention these numbered buoys at various points here, and just keep in mind the way that they're numbered. The numbers are going to decrease as you travel outbound. So Pappy's Pride is going to pass buoy 12 and then 11 and then 10.
I like that you've picked one where we get to say buoy a lot.
I know, because people love it.
They do.
So much. Back to the Bow Fortune, which had been anchored in the East Galveston Fairway anchorage up until 2:15, at which point the master began navigating her toward the point where she'd rendezvous with the pilot boat at 3 p.m. The master of Bow Fortune estimated visibility at 1.5 miles when the vessel was at anchor, and the pilot heading toward the tanker stated that visibility was clear from the harbor through the Bolivar Road's anchorage areas. Pilot boards at 3 p.m., just as planned, and at the time he boarded the vessel, he estimated visibility had dropped to 1/4 mile to port and about 3/4 of a mile to starboard.
1/4 of a mile is like definitely less than I would like to be able to see.
That's not...
This doesn't feel like a lot of time to react.
Not very far when you're navigating a big ship. So yeah, this fog that we'll see, it sets in fast and thick here. So during the master and pilot exchange, the ship's checklist was signed with the note that conditions are foggy with poor visibility. The discussion between the master and pilot, they came to a decision to continue inbound due to the pilot's assurances that conditions in the harbor were clear. He'd just come from there. He knew that everything was fine once they got out of this bit of fog.
Yeah, it's just interesting how variable the conditions are here. It's not something I would have necessarily thought in Galveston. It's something you associate more with like a San Francisco or something like that, where like legitimately there could be microclimates and things like that. It's just not something I would associate in Galveston, but apparently it doesn't sound like this is uncommon.
And I guess maybe that's a factor also in the winter. I don't know if that would affect things also if it's worse in the winter. So a few details about the pilot who's just boarded Bow Fortune. He's 50 years old at the time, with 28 years of maritime experience, 14 years skippering towing vessels, and 10 years as a commissioned state pilot.
Okay, so he sounds exceptionally qualified as well.
Yeah, pretty much everyone here, everyone involved with the navigation of these ships is very experienced, has spent a lot of time with and on these ships.
To the best of our knowledge, isn't like a relative of someone who already had a good job and got it, that kind of thing.
Not that we know of. So in addition to those pretty impressive qualifications, he'd also worked with the master and crew of Bow Fortune before, and he had a good professional relationship with them. The tangibles and the intangibles are all here for, a good passage through to the harbor. The pilot set up 2 portable pilot units and told the master of outbound traffic that he'd be arranging port-to-port passes with all outbound vessels. I wasn't familiar with what a portable pilot unit or a PPU was.
I'm not either.
But it's a system of sensors and a display that gives the pilot important information about the ship and its surroundings. So it's just sensors that are placed, and then it gives the pilot what he needs to know about the surroundings. And I was on the website of a company that makes these called ProSurtech. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I did always wonder, like, because you see like videos of pilots boarding ships, and they very often have a bag or a backpack. And I always wondered, like, what's in the bag?
I assumed it was like snacks.
And apparently this is one of the things they might have in the bag with them. So quoting here from the ProSurtech website, talking about their PPUs.
The complete system consists of 3 pod units, small, lightweight, and hard-wearing, which communicate wirelessly with the electronic nautical chart system, enabling their easy transport and installation. Our PPUs can be carried in a backpack and are installed in seconds, with the 3 pod units and a notebook, and thanks to the wireless connection, it will all be up and running in moments.
So the pilot also instructed one of the deckhands to take up a lookout position at the bow. Later, we'll actually see a few correlations in the story, a few connections to the duck boat episode we did in Philadelphia with Tom, where you have, pretty big ship and significantly smaller vessel. Here, as opposed to in that episode, we do have a bow lookout being posted.
Yeah, it seems like the large vessel is doing a much better job of paying attention in this one.
And again, it's probably owing to the fact that they've done this many, many, many times before. The decision was made by the pilot and master to keep the foghorn sounding as they continued inbound. Pretty standard stuff. Literally the point of a foghorn.
Right.
So the con was officially handed over from the master to the pilot at 3:07 p.m. So this is right around the time that Pappy's Pride is passing the highway ferry slips at Port Bolivar. A minute later, the pilot contacted Vessel Traffic Service, Houston Galveston, and informed them that Bow Fortune was inbound. At 3:10, the pilot began making passing arrangements with 6 outbound vessels. This was done via radio, with the pilot addressing each vessel by name. Among these were Torm Republican, Maersk Ohio, and Zia Ama. By 3:24, Bow Fortune was in the Galveston Bay entrance channel.
That's so much to do so quickly if you're the pilot, to like get oriented and then immediately start setting up these passing arrangements.
Well, yeah, like you and I were talking about before we started recording, is you look at just how enormously busy this area is, in this pretty narrow area, how many vessels and different types of vessels that you've got going in and out. Plus you throw in the variables of the much smaller vessels, as we'll talk about here. So here a third vessel of interest enters the story, and this is the tanker Chemical Atlantic.
I like how they spelled Atlantic.
With a K. She's traveling outbound through the channel. Pilot on board Chemical Atlantic stated that he had a visual on the also outbound Pappy's Pride up until buoy 12. And that's the same location that deckhand number 3 reported that drastic reduction in visibility.
So we know that that's true, essentially, that area past that point, like, definitely has limited visibility. Multiple people are saying it.
Yeah, so she has sailed into this fog bank, basically, and no one's going to see her until the end here. So at this point, the pilot said he could no longer see Pappy's Pride or any other vessel in the area, but she was still visible on radar and AIS, which is the Automated Identification System. Chemical Atlantic started sounding her fog signal at this time. At 3:31, Chemical Atlantic passed Pappy's Pride at buoy 10 with the fishing vessel to port. So Pappy's Pride is now clear of the anchorage area, and she then made a turn to starboard and made a course for the channel at about 30-degree angle of intersection. Going to quote a bit here directly from the NTSB report for the next span of time here.
At 15:32, the Bow Fortune pilot made a passing agreement with the pilot on the Chemical Atlantic. The Bow Fortune pilot told investigators that because the Chemical Atlantic had finished its turn across the channel's centerline, he intended to finish the Bow Fortune's turn on the outer edge of the outer bar channel and give the channel to the Chemical Atlantic. The pilot stated he was at full speed as the Bow Fortune approached the Galveston entrance, between the seaward ends of the jetty walls to counteract the effect of the combined .7 knot ebb current setting to the northwest with an ocean current, which the pilot estimates as a 1.5 knot cross current setting to the north.
So as they're entering here, traveling full speed ahead in this situation, this was common standard practice and in line with what the other vessels were doing at the time.
It makes sense having to like fight those currents and stuff. Like you've got to go in there with a little force, otherwise, you know, you're going to get pushed all around that space.
Yeah, similar to like when you anything involving airplanes taking off and landing, you know, having to be aware of crosswinds as you're doing these things.
There's a lot of things like that. Even like just merging on or off the highway, like you have to go at speed of whatever it is you're doing.
Because that'll come up later as to, you know, why Bow Fortune was traveling at that speed. Why was she in the location she was in? And as you see here, this is all very standard stuff. So while this is happening, Pappy's Pride was on course towards buoys 7 and 8. And at 3:34, she was 0.14 miles, which is only 246 yards or 223 meters north of the channel. Soon, the pilot on board Bow Fortune noticed the fishing vessel on his PPU, quote, showing he was coming towards the channel. At 3:35, so this is just after seeing her on the display, pilot hailed Pappy's Pride twice, receiving no response. However, electronic data did show that the fishing boat turned 19 degrees to port, putting her on a vector to enter the channel at a very shallow angle and cross just ahead of Bow Fortune.
It just doesn't sound good. Like shallow angle. I don't know. Phrases like that start to like it just feels like you're trying to cut off the angle when you shouldn't be.
Right, and my understanding of it is that this puts her on a closer course to Bow Fortune than she would have been originally.
Right.
So with the lack of acknowledgement from Pappy's Pride, the pilot sounded 5 short blasts of Bow Fortune's horn. So this is another standard practice, 5 short blasts in accordance with Rule 34. Yes, Rule 34.
Is that really?
Yes. The other one. Of the Convention on the International Regulations for Preventing Collisions at Sea. It's referred to as the danger signal, and it's done to indicate that you don't understand the intentions or actions of another vessel, or are in doubt whether sufficient action is being taken to avoid a collision.
Interesting. And if people do want to read more about that, they can just Google Rule 34.
See what happens.
Yeah. It's actually probably a good one to do the I'm feeling lucky button on Google. Just take whatever it gives you.
So back on board Pappy's Pride, deckhand number 3 stated later that he could hear fog signals in the distance, but never heard the signal from his own vessel. So with the poor visibility around them, deckhand number 3 said he was surprised when they heard the first whistle from Bow Fortune. On hearing the second, they looked up and saw, quote, this ship coming out of the fog.
That has to be a bad feeling.
Yeah, we've talked about collisions under heavy fog, and it always seems to happen that way. In an interview with Houston TV station KHOU, he estimated that he had about 10 seconds to react. He'd also state that at no point during the lead up to the accident did Pappy's Pride alter her engine speed despite the fog. At 3:37 and 32 seconds, the vessels collided, with Bow Fortune traveling at a speed of 10.8 knots. Pappy's Pride capsized, though stayed afloat as it passed down the port side of Bow Fortune. The pilot on board Bow Fortune immediately called VTS and reported the collision, in addition to issuing a mayday call for assistance. You'd assume that as this is happening and becoming more and more imminent, he's probably becoming mentally prepared to do so, because he's able to do it very quickly. The Coast Guard started the search and rescue operation at 3:40, and responding to that mayday call, the pilot boat Yellow Rose rescued one person from the water at 3:54. This is about 17 minutes after the collision, and this was deckhand number 3, whose statements we've been using occasionally. Can you guess why he's the only person we've been quoting from Pappy's Pride?
So essentially, he's the lucky one because he was, on deck, basically? And probably got thrown into the water?
Correct. As might be expected with 2 vessels of such different size, damage to Bow Fortune was minimal, with just a small dent being observed in her port bow and no flooding being reported. The Coast Guard recovered deckhand number 2. unresponsive from the water, and he was pronounced dead just after 5 p.m., so about an hour and a half after the collision. The bodies of deckhand number 1 and the captain both remained missing during that initial search. So we've gotten through the actual collision itself, getting into some of the aftermath and the investigation portions here.
I guess just one other thing with like the actual incident, like it is interesting, like how quickly, we see this with like when you're able to respond quickly to something like this, that a lot of times like your survival chances are better.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me wonder with like deckhand 2, like what happened? Why I would be interested to know like that autopsy report. Like, did he drown? I'm assuming he drowned, but like, was he stuck somewhere on board the vessel and like, did his body get out, or why wasn't he able to survive the way that the other deckhand was?
Well, and it's hard to know because obviously we don't have his testimony about this, but we do know at least that deckhand number 3, he did at least have that, 10-second whatever window where he saw this about to happen, whatever preparation he was able to do, whether that was just preparing to jump in the water, jumping overboard, getting free of the boat. Yeah, it's kind of hard to guess what the difference was there.
Yeah, that's something that's always that's always interesting, is like, why does one person survive and another person not?
So that had happened on January 14th. The search was suspended on January 16th. This happened in a very highly trafficked area, so locating the Pappy's Pride wasn't that much of a challenge. She was raised from the Outer Bar Channel on January 30th. Some combined efforts from, I believe it was the Galveston County Sheriff's Office, the U.S. Coast Guard, and also the Army Corps of Engineers.
Nice.
That was a little over 2 weeks after she sank. The place where she sank, just looking at the fathom chart that's included, I couldn't quite get an exact spot, but that area that she sank in, about 37 fathoms, so about 225 feet deep.
Pretty deep.
There were some challenges and some delays with raising the vessel due to weather complications and floating debris in the area.
I imagine it's a pretty busy area in general.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably about like shutting down a lane of a highway to get this stuff. So in the best possible outcome by this point, the bodies of both deckhand 1 and the captain were both able to be recovered from the wheelhouse. Autopsy reports on the 3 deceased crew of Pappy's Pride ruled the cause of death to be drowning, with no evidence of traumatic injuries suffered. Toxicology reports were negative, and testing was also done on the operational crew of Bow Fortune and the VTS watchstanders on duty at the time of the accident. Nothing came back questionable, anything out of the ordinary.
I'm just imagining like one of these VTS guys being like really nervous about having to do like a drug screen or something, like for something he had no part in.
So more into the investigation here. One of the things that was looked into was the qualifications of the personnel involved, which was all found to be appropriate to the positions they held.
Yeah, this definitely seems like a case where everyone is actually qualified to be doing the job they're doing.
Work and rest schedules are also ruled not to be factors in the collision, as was intoxication, as previously mentioned. Another factor ruled out was the configuration of the waterway and all mechanical and propulsion systems on both vessels. One of the shortcomings revealed on Pappy's Pride was that she had only one functional VHF radio and antenna combination. She had 3 of these physically on board, but 4 days before her departure, 2 of her antennas were found to be faulty, along with one of the radios. So the one good antenna was connected to one of the good radios, and the repairs were planned for when the vessel arrived in Mobile, Alabama. Regarding the accident itself, it was determined that the radio's dual watch capability would have given the captain the same ability to scan both required channels. So again, like with the Philly duck boats, those 2 channels being the VTS channel and the bridge-to-bridge channel. So this isn't mentioned in the report, but like I would be curious to know, they had fixed this by rigging one of the radios to one of the antennas that weren't originally connected. And I don't know, I don't think it's mentioned in the report, did Pappy's Pride successfully communicate with anyone on this trip?
Right. Yeah, because you would think that at some point they would have had to have acknowledged someone. Right.
At some point leaving harbor, I didn't see any mention of her having any sort of exchange with anyone. So my question would be like, did it actually work?
Or are they wondering why no one's talking to them?
Right. Yeah, it's because it's just very strange. This whole thing kind of leaves us with not a lot of answers about why was there no response, why was there no reaction to this. And just knowing that they'd had these issues before, I feel like that's a relevant thing to want to know of, like, were they able to communicate with anyone, or was this just a problem unique to communicating with Bow Fortune?
Yeah, and I mean, like, as you look through this, you can rule out so many things, that sleep isn't a factor, drugs aren't a factor, alcohol is not a factor, training's not a factor. It appears that everyone takes safety, seriously enough. Something weird has to be going on, basically.
Yeah. So regarding the navigational tools on board Pappy's Pride, just, on paper with the stuff that they have available, this would have been a foreseeable collision based on that technology. From the analysis portion here of the NTSB report,
the captain's navigation software was capable of showing the Pappy's Pride and Bow Fortune's AIS. The electronic chart would also have shown the GPS position of the Pappy's Pride, how close his vessel was to the channel, and his vessel's predicted course over ground and speed over ground vector. The electronic chart also would have the positions and vectors of the Bow Fortune and Chemical Atlantic, and would have shown that the vessels would have been meeting near the Pappy's Pride. Further, the vessel's radar would have shown the Bow Fortune's echo, despite the fog, and the ARPA, Automatic Radar Plotting Aid, would have shown a potential risk of collision.
So kind of like with more connections to, air disaster stories here, is with these modern systems, some of this stuff is automated. So if you have your plotting going on, it's going to tell you, like, hey, there's a ship here, you are going to run into it.
Mm-hmm.
Pappy's Pride AIS information showed that the captain was actively steering the boat as she transited the anchorage. Most of this happening with near zero visibility. So this is a good thing. It's good that he's manually steering the boat. Several minutes before the collision, with the vessels about 2 miles apart, visibility for Pappy's Pride would have been about 0.2 miles. But that's why you've got those tools to tell you what are you not seeing here. Bow Fortune sounded the danger signal, those 5 short blasts, twice, with the second time coming about 22 seconds before the collision. Yeah, and just with the size disparity, you have this this pretty large tanker. This is not the first time it's come up. I know most of our listeners are familiar with this, but it's hard to overstate, like, how little Bow Fortune can do here.
Mm-hmm.
Traveling at the speed she's traveling at in the place she's traveling at, if this smaller vessel isn't moving, there's just not a lot she can do.
Right. Yeah, there just isn't.
The pilot's PPU captured a 15-degree course change just before the collision. Deckhand number 3 told investigators he hadn't noticed the fishing vessel turn, but this would have been just before it. He easily is probably distracted by this big ship looming up out of the fog.
Right.
That course change to port was only 15 seconds before the collision. It may have just been an attempt to avoid the collision. However, had that been the case, the course change, under ideal circumstances, should have been to starboard, in accordance with the Colreg's rules. It's estimated that if Pappy's Pride had kept her initial course, the collision may have been avoided or minimized.
Yeah, that's the other thing, I guess, here is, like, even if you couldn't have avoided it, maybe you don't hit such an aggressive angle that results in capsize.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, is not going too far with this, because, like, we've talked about that sailing yacht that had that collision with the Pride of Bilbao ferry, and that was a enormous size disparity. This, Pappy's Pride is much smaller, but she's not a little sailboat.
Right.
A slight change in angle maybe changes the story a little bit. The speed of Bow Fortune at the time of the collision indicated that she'd been able to make a very negligible reduction in speed, but not nearly enough to prevent the accident. So all things considered, the sinking of Pappy's Pride, the loss of those 3 lives, comes down to what was happening in the wheelhouse in the minutes before she collided with Bow Fortune. And unfortunately, there's really no satisfactory answer to that, given the lack of any survivors who can attest to what happened in the wheelhouse.
Investigators could not determine why the fishing vessel did not slow or take substantial action to avoid transiting into the channel directly in front of the tanker, or what the captain was doing in the minutes leading up to the collision. It is possible the captain was away from the con, was distracted, fell asleep, was unsure of what action to take, or was otherwise unable to respond to the developing situation.
So they put out those list of possible theories. That's such a broad range of things that it's not really a guess at all. It's just kind of what possible things could have happened. The NTSB report does note that the captain had been admitted to the hospital 3 weeks earlier with a minor stroke.
Mm-hmm.
They do put forward the possibility that something similar may have happened, talking about the captain being incapacitated. There's no evidence to confirm that. The autopsy didn't confirm that. But just kind of looking for anything, because there's not a lot that makes sense about this. We talked about the radio being a possible factor in this, and really the only other one that stands out is the possibility of a medical emergency.
The only other thing, and I would assume that they would have looked at this, so this is 100% speculation. I mean, a distraction with like a device of some sort, like a cell phone, like we saw in the duck boat thing.
It's possible.
Is that addressed in there at all?
I think they just kind of include that under the umbrella of distraction. They don't mention devices specifically, but at the same time, it's like something else had to have been happening too. Because like, even if there's a distraction, you'd have to think that if the radio is functioning, he's getting these hails from another vessel.
Yeah, to me, it like off the top of my head, it feels like medical emergency makes the most sense.
And actually, looking at we had this discussion before we started, and again, this is all speculation just based on a possible reconstruction, but we talked about the positioning of the crew, because as this is starting, all the crew are out on deck. But, ultimately, when the sinking happens, the captain and one of the deckhands are found in the wheelhouse. So at some point, that deckhand entered the wheelhouse.
Probably wondering what was going on.
Yeah, while this was imminent. So, I mean, we talked about the possibility of if there's a medical emergency and maybe that deckhand has some concerns about how they're navigating. He just wants to go see, hey, what's up? What's going on? Maybe that final course change, that very last second,
trying to
maybe that's him jumping in and trying to do something last minute. All speculation.
Which could also explain why maybe they didn't turn the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, if you're jumping in, just trying to do anything to get out of the way, not knowing the deckhand's qualifications, he might not be up on, best practices for avoiding collision. Again, all speculation, but something that is a possibility when it comes to a medical emergency.
Not to take it too far, but as to why they don't get out of the pilot house, if the captain is having a stroke, he can't get out. And then, like, do you leave him? Or can you even leave him at that point? You know what I mean? Like, so yeah, like it is all speculation, but I think there is like a really plausible scenario that unfortunately, like this is probably like due to a medical emergency, which doesn't make it any easier, but I think it does make it a little bit, I guess, better in a way that it's not negligence or something like that, that it truly is an accident.
It would speak to the responsiveness and the responsibility of that deckhand jumping in to try and see what's going on. So yeah, I mean, this one just leaves us with not a ton of answers. I mean, there's obviously the ultimate cause, but we don't know what led to that. The families of the deceased crew, they did initially file claims against Oldfield SE, the owners of Bow Fortune, alleging failure to operate in a safe manner and failure to properly inspect and maintain the vessel.
Do they have any like evidence or any interesting things that they present to this?
No, not that I know of. I mean, as we saw with the report, NTSB is usually really good about these things. If there was any sort of shortcoming like that, probably would have come out in the report. But again, pretty standard stuff for an incident like that. Right away, families are going to jump in and go for whatever they can get. I mean, that's what these lawyers do. That's literally what their job is. So, I mean, it's not surprising that would be the case. But yeah, as this looking through, it's very hard to find anything to really blame Bow Fortune for.
Yeah, again, in this scenario, like the big corporation didn't do anything wrong.
And like, yeah, it's like not even that. It's like, I mean, this really comes down to, this is really impugning the skills of the pilot, who all appearances say was well-trained, well-qualified, very experienced, did everything he was supposed to do. Like we said, a ship of this size, like it's not slamming on brakes and avoiding this.
Well, I think also, like we were saying, that has to be a pretty small community of people. And you probably know a lot of the same people as a lot of the fishermen and the captains of those boats. Like, kind of not, I don't know if it's legally slander, but to kind of, publicly tarnish that reputation is a big thing, I would imagine.
Yeah. I mean, like the legal aspect and then also like the personal aspect of it. It's like, I'd have to assume that probably messes you up on some level, even as the pilot, knowing you did nothing wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, from my point of view, like I've dealt with this in the trucking industry of dealing with accidents that, I've dealt with fatal accidents. And even when it's not our driver's fault, like, you're still involved in it. And like that takes a real toll, even if there literally was nothing you could do, it's still a traumatic experience.
This one was so recent, and I wasn't able to find any of the results of any of those lawsuits. I mean, it's very well they could still be ongoing with something that happened in 2020. And, like, as we've seen often, the information found in the NTSB report isn't always used or, like, I don't know, permissible in court. That's not really the point of the NTSB report. They're not out to assess blame on a legal level for this. Something to at least keep an eye on. Based on what I was finding, I couldn't find any solid answers for if anything resulted from those lawsuits. Final conclusions from the report. It's a very short section. They put the probable cause for the accident as Pappy's Pride's failure to avoid a close quarters situation and restricted visibility, along with a lack of communication with other vessels.
I think that's a really good way of phrasing it, and also pointing out what you're saying, which is the NTSB is not interested in saying whose fault it was, but purely why did this happen? And like the why is that the Pappy's Pride, didn't avoid a close quarter situation, but like not saying, because we don't know why it happened, that the Pappy's Pride inherently did anything wrong.
Yeah.
More that it just failed to avoid a situation.
So, it doesn't appear that Balfortune could have done much different. Her crew or her pilot, traveling in a manner and speed expected for a ship traveling inbound to Galveston, made the proper attempts at communication, and sounded the appropriate warnings when a collision appeared imminent. Unfortunately, the lesson to draw from this sometimes is that, you can do everything right and still be involved in an incident like this.
Yeah, I think that's what we, kind of the thing we've always talked about is like, this is hard when everything goes right. So don't make it harder by not being safe or by being, lazy with those kind of things or not doing maintenance. Like, everyone here is pretty much doing what they're supposed to do, and it's still a bad day.
That wraps up our episode here on the Pappy's Pride. There are several news articles, mainly from local Galveston papers and stuff. Some of those were used as sources. Most of the information came directly from the NTSB report. Things like names, ages, those things are available in those newspaper articles. We'll share some of those in the sources. And actually, this episode led me to what's probably our next bonus episode topic. It's going to also involve Galveston, and gonna see the good people of Galveston's connections with, that's right, the Nazis.
Oh no,
the Adolf Hitler Nazis from World War II.
That's not good.
And how much they loved being visited by ships from the Kriegsmarine.
I can't wait to learn more.
We'll get into that at some point soon. So that finishes things up for this week. Good to be back doing another recording. And I guess with that, unless you have anything else, we will wrap things up here. And we will get this out, and we will just talk to you all next week.